Okay, this is a short video demo about values in preparation for closed grisaille. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got my grisaille mixture, and I want to have a shadow value. So I've got my shadow value right there. I just used burnt sienna for that with a little ultramarine blue. And I can make this part of the shadow just a little bit darker. So you can see that clearly. Take a dry brush, maybe make this a little bit lighter. My paint's a little wet right now. I don't know if you're able to see that. I'm going to move the camera closer. Let's see. That might be a little bit easier to see. What I want to do is just show two clear values in the shadows to get my point across. So there's two values in the shadow. Then I'm going to take a separate brush and make a light mixture. So I'm mixing some burnt sienna with white to make a light mixture. If you want to put a little teeny bit of blue in it, if you want a slightly cooler light mixture, you could. So I'm going to start out just checking to see if you're able to see this. And let me just do one little easel adjustment. There we go. Okay, so this is my light mixture. So now we've got three values, excuse me. Here's our separation of light and shadow. So here's our shadow, and these are starting up into our lights. So I'm going to go ahead and mix three separate values in the lights. So I've got 1, 2, okay. 3. I'm going to call this dark light, middle light, and light light. And then up here, we've got a highlight. So my highlight is almost completely white. Okay, so now I've got shadow, light, two values in the shadow, and basically three form values in the light and a highlight. So I'm going to call this dark light, middle light, and light light. They make up the form. And then the top one is the highlight, which is a reflection from the environment. So these are the values you're going to be working with now as we go into closed grisaille. And you could, just because I want you to know this, we could put a dark accent right down there. So dark accent, basically two values there. So if I included a dark accent, we'd basically have 4 values in the light and 3 values in the shadow. That would be 7 values. But I want to keep it as simple as possible. But let's label these so we don't forget. So what we've got here is, this is dark light. Okay. Middle light. light, light. Highlight. And I'm just going to call this DA for dark accent. Okay, and we've separated light and shadow right here. Shadow, light. Okay, so those are basically, if we follow this, it would be 7 values, but if we made this only 2 and 3, there's 5 main values. Okay, so we want to start out with that, and this is the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and this is really burnt sienna and white, but if you want to make it slightly cooler, you could have a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed in with the burnt sienna. So that's the first thing you're going to do, is set up a value scale. Then we're going to make the ball. So let's make sure you guys can still see this. So I'm going to draw a sphere. I'm so accustomed to working with straight lines and angles that I even do this for making a sphere. Okay. So we've got our spherical shape here. And I'm gonna separate light and shadow. Okay, so the light's coming this way. There's your light beam. So there's a sphere with light and shadow separated. So let's mask in the shadow. We always want to keep in mind the separation of light and shadow. It's very important when you're working with values that you're clear on this, because where the shadow is says something about the form. That's why when we start out studying, we try to make things really clear, very clear light and shadow separations, one light source, nice and organized. Okay, so I'm working on the toned canvas. Just going to clean this sphere up a little bit. So at this point it's flat and graphic, just the light and shadow separated. We haven't created a sense of volume yet with the values. So this is the equivalent to our first stage when we're drawing or painting, when you've got the graphic aspect set up. Okay, so the light beam hits this way. This is the terminator of the shadow. Anything beyond the terminator of the shadow, the light beam doesn't hit. The light beam will hit here and here and here up to this point, and then none of the rest of this gets hit by the light beam. So this is, now we're talking about the anatomy of light on form. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to have the dark accent is going to be the really dark spot down here. So we'll just put a little dark accent that's exactly underneath here. And the shadow itself, I'm going to just make this a little bit darker. Paint's a little wet with terp, so it's not going to get too dark. The shadow itself is going to be a little lighter down here. This is going to be the reflected light. That's where the light from the environment bounces back in, hits the sphere, and creates the reflections down here, reflected light. And the terminator is going to be darker. Okay, so the terminator, see if I can get this a little bit better. As the light bounces in, hits down here, but does not hit where the terminator is. So consequently, the terminator is going to be darker than the area of the reflected light because of the spherical shape. So we try to think of things in planes so we can see how the light beams are hitting the planes. And it's going to hit the plane, if we planed out the ball as it goes up, it's going to receive less of the bounce in light, which is why the terminator is darker than the part closer to the, you know, the cast shadow and the dark accent. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take that off because it's not reading. Let's just do this for now. So now we can see the terminator. It's not exactly a sphere either, but it's okay. Good enough for me for right now. Terminator is darker. There. So right now, we basically got light and shadow separated, and then within the shadow, I indicated the reflected light. But for all intents and purposes, it's the two values. Okay, so now what I'm going to do to build form in here is start with the dark light value. So you can do this a couple ways. You can either pre-mix several values in the light if you want to do it that way, or you can kind of mix them as you go along. Let's see what we got here. So I'm going to cover my whole light mass with a darkish light. So this may end up being the middle light. In fact, it probably will. This is to represent the flesh tone. So if you were doing a portrait, your first pass in the light would be a lowish value light. It's often a middle light. And then we'll be able to add the darker and the lighter lights. But I'm going to add this on the whole thing. It's still flat and graphic. So when you're doing your closed grisaille, your first step is going to be to do an overall light that's pretty low in value. So in my mind, I'm thinking that that kind of corresponds to the dark light over here. But let's see, I may end up making that plane darker. So then I'm gonna add more light on. And when I add my next layer of light, I'm gonna bring it down here, but I'm not gonna bring it all the way to the terminator. I'm going to leave a band, a value, that's going to then represent the dark light. So I'm bringing the next layer of light on, and I'm going to cover everything except one narrow band. Okay, so now we've got two values in the lights. I want you guys to be able to see that a little bit better. I'm looking into the camera, which is my phone, to be able to see how it looks. So I'm just going to darken this one back down a little bit. This basically is representing the dark light, otherwise known as halftone. I've heard it called both. We tend to call it the dark light, but it is part of the light mass. There, that's a little more clear, I think. So this is basically the turning value. That's what turns the form. Okay. Reflected light, terminator, dark light, middle light. Now let's put on a light light. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add more light here, but I'm not going to come all the way down to here. I'm going to leave another band. And the next band I'm going to make a little wider than the first band. So sometimes these are called modeling factors. Okay, so now we've got our dark light, middle light, light light, and they're conceptualized as successive bands. This is a narrow band, a little bit wider and a little bit wider. So those are the three main values that you need in order to model form. So dark light, middle light, light light, and then what about the highlight? Well, these three main values, modeling factors, are a result of how the light is hitting this spherical form. The reflected light is a bounce in light which comes from a different direction. So it's not part of the main form. So depending on what's happening, we're just going to put the reflected light right over here. So it depends on where you are. If you're in a room and you're walking around the model, the reflected light's going to move dependent on where you're standing. So wherever it's bouncing in from, the reflected light is, let's say it's bouncing in from right here, it'd be coming in this way, and then it would be bouncing into my eye at a 45-degree angle. Okay, so now we've got our basic modeling factors. So let's just clean this up a little bit. Oh, I know, I'm going to label it. So we've got the same thing that we have here. I'm going to be thinking about here. All right, so this is going to be the terminator of the shadow. So let's label this TS. Right here, terminator of the shadow. I need a better brush to do this with. Okay, then, so the terminator of the shadow is where the light ends and the shadow begins, or the shadow ends and the light begins. It's right along here, and we want to remember that it's darker than the reflected light, right? Because the reflected light bounces in, but as the sphere goes away this way, it's receiving less of the reflected light. So we've got the terminator of the shadow. Okay, then this next narrow band is dark light. Dark light. And going up, this is the middle light. And this top one is the light light. corresponding to these, and then this is the highlight. And then finally, down here, this is the reflected light. Okay, and I didn't put in the shadow and the dark accent, but the dark accent would be down at the bottom. And then if I just want to clean this up a little bit, I can come in with my brush, make sure there's not too much paint on it. Let's just see if I can, if I want to unify this just a little, ease this transition just a little. So in the end, we're making really cut out transitions more than probably exists in nature, but as a way to set up a model for understanding this. So I eased them in just a little bit. Cleaning that up a little bit. And I want to leave the upper values fairly clear so you have a good understanding of the difference. Let's see if I can get this cleaned up a little bit. Hope my head isn't in the front of the camera. Okay. But so there it is, very clear and concise. What will happen when you're painting is that eventually this just gets eased a little bit, or there's another value in between. If you put another value in between there, it makes them transition even more. But for the sake of being able to understand this, I just want you to see that we have now created a ball with volume. So okay, a couple of things that are really important. Anything that's in the light mixture, don't put it in for the reflected light. It's very tempting. I see this in beginners all the time. They take some of this and they paint it right into there. You don't want to do that. First thing is, everything in the light, which is from here up, everything in the light should be lighter than anything in the shadows. And as soon as you put any of this in the shadows, even if you're saying, well, you know, it's a white ball on a black cloth and the reflected light looks blah, 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 none of that matters. You've got to keep them theoretically separated. So don't put any of your skin tone mixture into this shadow. Just let that be, you know, from being wiped out. So this is for closed grisaille. Yeah, so your first pass in the light mask, try to use a middle to a dark light, okay? As you saw, I thought I was starting with a dark light, but it really was about a middle. But you take one value, not the lightest value, a middle or a dark light, and put it over the whole light mass. Okay, so it's the equivalent to like about here. Then I added my next layer in the light. If your first pass was really low in light, then your second pass can represent the middle light, but you cover everything, right? You're going to cover everything in the second pass except that dark light. Then on your third pass, you're going to put the light, right? And you're going to come only down to about here. So depending on how dark your first pass was, you can either just subsequently, it's like Photoshop layers. Each one will cover less and less. You know, it's like a topographical map, right? That's the mountains. Or if you have to, you can then add in this to make it darker that way and have this be your beginning and add in the light. But your end result is you want to end up with 1, 2, 3 main values describing form, and then the highlight is just the cherry on the top. And the dark light is the narrowest band, then the middle light's a little wider, and then the light's a little wider. So as a plane, if these each represented planes, as the planes turn away from the light, they become darker. This is still receiving light, but it's really turned away from these light beams. The light beams are barely catching this. And then as soon as it hits the terminator, it's all underneath and not being impacted by the light beam. So when you start your closed grisaille, start with your first pass with a light mixture. Okay, but make a scale over here first. Okay, thanks.